Hi there, Adam Harris here, founder and CEO of As I Am, Ireland's autism charity, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Dream Space Live webinar, which is exploring autism, separating fact from fiction. This webinar comes at a time that As I Am is hosting the 14th Autism Europe Congress in Dublin. This Congress is creating a space for us to explore quality of life in terms of research, policy and practice for Ireland's autistic community and indeed the autism community across Europe and the wider world. Central to the quality of life of autistic people is ensuring that we live in communities that are informed, accepting and accessible of autistic people. Sadly, we are living through a time where we've seen a stark growth in misinformation around autism, contributing to stigma, heightening barriers for our community, and preventing autistic people from having the same chance to live, work, and play in our communities. That is why we are inviting you to this webinar today. In hosting the 14th Autism Europe Congress, we don't just seek to host an accessible and impactful event. We seek to change Dublin and Ireland to make it a truly accessible and understanding country for our community. Today we are inviting you to take the time to hear from this webinar. By going on this journey with us over the course of this session, you will gain an insight into the lived experiences of autistic people. You will be able to separate the fact from the fiction, and critically you will gain understanding and build capacity so you can support autistic people in the world of work and in day-to-day life. At least 1 in 20 people in our school system in Ireland are thought to be autistic, and we know that this is a number that is likely to be replicated in broader Irish society. It is critical that every community in Ireland is understanding and accepting of autistic people. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Please not only take the time to learn today, but work with us to put that learning into action in your community.
Hello and welcome to Dream Space Live, Autism Separating Fact from Fiction, with me, Michael, your host for this very special session, live from Microsoft Ireland. Now, in today's session, it's a very, very special one because we are joined by an expert, Caitlin from As I Am. Hey, Caitlin.
Hi, so my name is Caitlin. I'm the Training and Accreditation Manager in As I Am. And what my job does and what my team does is we help other people understand more about autism. So that's what we're here today.
Amazing. So today's session is going to be jam-packed. It's a very short session, but we're going to be covering a lot. Straight off from the top, folks, I want to say that we have our Q&A open, so be sure to let us know where you're actually joining us from. And if you have any questions along the way, pop them in there as well. And if we have the opportunity to do so, myself and Caitlin will respond to those. But first and foremost, Caitlin, let's have a quick look at the very tip top, what exactly is autism? So a definition that we're going to be working on for this session is that autism is a lifelong neurodevelopment disability or difference which relates to how a person communicates and interacts with others and how they experience the world around them. Now, when we actually look at it, Caitlin, there is 2 scans on our screens right now. One for what we would classify as a neurotypical brain and one as an autistic brain. To make sure we kind of set the scene, what exactly does a neurotypical brain mean, if that's not a term people are familiar with?
Yeah, so a neurotypical brain is a brain that has developed in what we call a typical way. So most people in the world are neurotypical. 80 to 85% of the world is neurotypical. And then there is some other different types of brains. So we have loads of different types of brains. One would be ADHD, a dyslexic brain, a dyspraxic brain, and an autistic brain is one of those different types of brains. When we talk about autism, sometimes we talk about it as if it's an illness or a disease, but it's actually neither of those things. It's a neurological difference, which means I'm autistic, which means that my brain has developed and looks very differently. So that's what we're looking at in these 2 images here. So we're looking at an autistic brain and the hyperconnectivity. So all the different parts of the brain that are lit up at one moment in time. Versus a neurotypical brain. Again, there's not as much going on in the neurotypical brain from a hyperconnectivity standpoint. And I think when we talk more about what autism actually is, we'll get to talk about, what those differences in an autistic brain like mine are.
So that's really interesting, Caitlin, because the imagery, I think, really kind of stands out. Like those scans give a great kind of justice for what we're going to be looking at in terms of that definition. And we kind of bolded some of those points there within that definition because we're going to kind of deep dive into each of those kind of elements.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about today that autism is a lifelong element of someone's life, not just something that we might have viewed just in the school or just in workplaces. It is a lifelong kind of experience. We're also going to be looking at it through the lens of communicating, interacting, and experiencing the world around them as well. Now, the first thing we want to kind of talk about, Kaylin, is the autism spectrum. Now, I think this is a very interesting one. Typically, I would say, and I'm going to act as kind of, let's say, maybe the mouthpiece for a lot of our joiners today who maybe have some misconceptions or even just kind of assumptions around what the world of autism is and the lived experience of an autistic person. And something we throw around quite a lot is the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
And we picture it as this kind of linear experience in which, okay, I'm, let's say, a 1 or a 2, and it's a little bit autistic, or you're maybe more so on the other side, very or severely autistic. But is this linear way of actually looking at it, Kaylin, is that the appropriate way of looking at it?
No, so this is a super oversimplified view, right? And we hear this quite a lot. We've also moved away from phrases like these, so a little bit, very or severely. It just doesn't accurately represent the autistic experience. It's so much more complicated than existing on just a linear spectrum. So it's a very unique individual experience, and we see that this kind of line that we look at when we talk about the spectrum doesn't allow for that individuality or that uniqueness within that.
Of course, because I think what's interesting is that people really try and have something concrete that they can relate to.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I know a scale from 1 to 10, so I'm just going to apply that to it. But as you can kind of see, that as what you just mentioned is not about the uniqueness of every person on this planet and the complexity of actually understanding who somebody is. You can't just put them into a specific number on a number line.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of leads us nicely into something that you introduced myself to, Kaylin, which is the autism spectrum wheel. So I want to tell us a little bit about what we're actually looking at here, which is clearly not a linear, but more of a cyclical kind of representation of it.
Yeah, so I think we like simple explanations for things as humans. You like to put things into categories and boxes and sum it up in a sentence or two, but autism isn't something that you can just sum up in a sentence or two. It's inherently way more complex. And so this spectrum colour wheel, which we've all probably seen the colour wheel, but we never break it down into what it actually is. So that's what I'm going to do today. So you can see the graph that we have here. There's different colours that represent essentially different autistic traits. And then an individual will come along and they will fill out what their experience is, right? Because what we always say is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Because we all are so very different in our experiences. And that's, again, like a really good key takeaway is that it's such an individual experience. And this colour wheel represents someone's individual preferences within the spectrum. So if we take routines, for example, there, you can see for this example, this person has put routines as kind of middle of the road, right? And that's where they have their pink dot. So that would mean for this person that routine and predictability is important. They have it in place in their everyday life, but you know, they might deviate outside of that routine sometimes, and it doesn't cause extreme stress or overwhelm. Another person might come along and they might put their little dot at the very, very outside, which means that really is important for them. Routine and predictability is super important for them in their everyday because that's what makes them feel safe and secure. So it's really individual, you know, for each person, kind of how much that trait or that autistic experience affects them.
And I think what's great about it is that it does allow us to maybe dip our toes a small bit more into the complex side of it. You know, that graph is not something that is just so linear of 1 through 10, because that has so many different variations, because that is us as human beings come in all different forms. But what's interesting there is there's a couple of terms there that might stand out at people that they might not know or may not have expected to actually be appearing on the wheel. I think the first one is masking, which is something we probably would have heard of. But what exactly is it, Kaylin?
So masking is a strategy whereby an autistic person essentially kind of hides their autistic traits. And the reason that they might do that is because at some point in their life, or maybe multiple points in their life, they may feel like who they are as an autistic person is not okay. And so what they do then is they hide all of their autistic traits and kind of bury them deep down and pretend to be neurotypical. They pretend to be someone that they're not. So what that might look like is forcing eye contact, rehearsing conversations, hiding the need to stim, maybe mimicking other people's body language and facial expressions, things like that. So again, again, it's trying any way that you can to maybe make yourself less of a target. For a lot of autistic people, maybe they might be picked on because of their differences. So this is something, it's what we call a social trauma response. It kicks in and it's your brain's way of trying to keep you safe. But it's really at the detriment of your mental health, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Hiding who you are, burying all those things and keeping them deep down, it doesn't go well for us as autistic people. It makes life inevitably way harder. It also is a barrier for diagnosis for a lot of people, because if they're masking, they're really burying all of their autistic traits deep down so no one else can see them. So that leads to a delay in diagnosis or misdiagnosis, which means that they don't get the support they need either. So it's a really kind of complicated and difficult thing for us to experience. We would see a lot of young girls would typically mask, which means that they don't get diagnosed as early as young boys.
And it's unfortunate to see a term such as masking having to be placed onto a wheel such as this, because of course it is something that is because of the world around them, rather than something that they themselves have to kind of represent or have a feel of. It's something they feel they have to do to fit into the world around them. And it's interesting about that one because we can combat that. If the world around does change a small bit, we can hopefully make sure that less people feel they have to mask as intensely or even mask at all.
Yeah.
Would that kind of be hopefully the kind of the goal or the kind of the dream?
Yeah, the goal is to kind of bring that understanding around masking, as every time we talk about autism, we're talking about masking as well, so that people understand what it is and why it happens.
Yeah.
It's really difficult because it's subconscious, right? So if you're masking, you don't always know that you're doing it until someone tells you. So by having that conversation and that awareness around it, people start to realize, oh, actually, I've been masking a big part of who I am. And some, like I said, young girls and women would be more susceptible to masking. So some of us are more likely to mask and can be quite high masking. And then other autistic people wouldn't have much experience in masking as well. So it just kind of depends person to person.
And I suppose if you recognize somebody in your life, or you yourself might possibly be masking, what are kind of some of the ways that you either can support an autistic person, or if yourself have recognized, oh, maybe I am masking myself, what are the kind of the supports you can put into place that might not be putting too much pressure on the individual?
Yeah, so I think it's always good to just have a conversation. If you want to approach someone, I think it's best to have that conversation in a general sense. So maybe not approach them and have the conversation, hey, you might be doing this, but kind of have just an information sharing where you can be like, hey, I learned more about autistic masking today and I've never knew about that or that it existed, and explain it to them, and they might be able through that conversation to recognize, hey, I do this. Because a lot of the time when I have that conversation with people and explain what masking is, they do realize I actually do that. And that's how they kind of start that journey of figuring out kind of who they are then as well. If you're trying to learn and you're sitting there thinking, I do this and it's something I want to learn more about, I would say do your research, have a look into it. There's information on our website asiam.ie, and you can have a look into what masking is, and try to figure out, is it something that you are experiencing or something that you do.
And I hope this is the kind of a reoccurring theme throughout today's session, which is takeaways of realizations about yourself, maybe for anyone who's joining us, or possibly realizations about the people around you as well, and how you can actually further support that. But another piece that's on that colour wheel, Caitlin, is that we have anxiety popping up there. Now, tell us a little bit about, is that, let's say, a mandatory or has to be a characteristic of an autistic person's life experience?
No, ideally it wouldn't be at all, if I'm being honest, Michael. It's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but the reason we have it on here is just autistic people are so susceptible to anxiety, and not just the emotion of anxiety that we all feel, but that chronic anxiety, that generalized anxiety disorder. A lot of people who are autistic will really struggle with high levels of anxiety, and that might be due to, like, again, some of the traits we see here. So the social communication differences, the sensory processing differences, maybe that need for routine but you don't have it in your life, leading to a lot of anxiety. So there's lots of different factors that come into play. I think another misconception we would see is that a lot of the time autistic people don't know that we're different, that we are different socially, or our communication differences, but we do. A lot of us very much feel that, because the thing is that when you live in a world where you're different, people remind you of it all the time. They don't let you away with anything. And so we're hyper aware that when we walk into these rooms, you know, we are different. We socialize and communicate differently. We experience the world differently. And so that leaves a lot of people with anxiety. So I would say if you're supporting autistic people, you know, keep an eye on those anxiety levels. And if someone is anxious quite a lot, that's something that they should be going to seek support with, and try to get some helpful tools to kind of manage that anxiety then.
100%. And I think between masking and anxiety, these are parts of this color wheel that hopefully maybe some of the things we take away from today can actually alleviate some of them for the people around us or those joining us as well. Now, we're going to do a little bit of an activity, folks. This is going to be where you're actually going to engage a small bit with the task. These are either mental checks in your head, or possibly if you have access to the Q&A for today's live event, you can actually let us know as well. So we're going to display 5 statements on screen, and it's going to be up to you all to just pause for a moment. We'll give you 2 minutes to do so. Just have a think, is it true or is it false? And maybe have a little bit of a think of the reasoning behind it as well. So just to call out some of those statements, the first one would be vaccines cause autism. So that would be our first one, and we want to have you guys think about, okay, 1 equals to T or 1 equals to F. Is it true or false for your understanding? Flexible communication choices help autistic people engage fully. Quiet areas or short sensory breaks support focus and well-being. And we also have bad parenting causes autism. Now, we also lastly have autism is, quote, on the rise, which I'm sure a lot of us have heard before. We want you guys to just have a think, and we don't want to do any spoilers here for any of the true or falses for these, but we're going to give 2 minutes on the clock just to give you guys the opportunity to categorize each one of these 5 statements under our true heading or a false heading, and we'll be back in a moment to actually break that down. Okay, welcome back, folks, and a massive thank you to everybody who's in the Q&A actually sounding off with their true or false statements. And even if you didn't, maybe you just did a little bit of a mental check-in on where you'd actually place them. So let's actually now reveal whether they're true or false. So our first statement was vaccines cause autism, and of course, Helen, this is going under our false category.
Yes.
So there's no credible scientific evidence linking vaccines to autism, and extensive studies have repeatedly confirmed their safety.
Yeah.
So obviously this is something that's been discussed quite a lot. We're living in a little bit of an era of a lot of misinformation going around, and unfortunately that probably is could be said to be on the rise. How do you typically tackle this within your role and when you encounter people who maybe state something like this?
Yeah, it's a really difficult time at the moment for us, Michael, in the autistic community, because we're hearing this so much at the moment. And we have seen that really big increase in misinformation, and it's tough. I think it's hard with this conversation, what this statement does is it actually takes away from our true messaging, which is how can we support autistic people?
Yeah.
The conversation of why is not important. Because when you have to talk about causation, you're inherently thinking that there's something terrible about autism, right? And that's really hard for us as autistic people to be on the receiving end of, because it invalidates our experience as human beings. We are here as autistic individuals, and all we would like is to be understood and supported. So we have this conversation around vaccines cause autism. You're distracting away from the actual conversation, which is how can we better understand and support autistic people, which is really in As I Am where we want the conversation to be, so that we can improve and support autistic people's lives.
I think it actually comes back as well to what we were talking about earlier on, which is that linear 1 through 10 spectrum. It is that people need to kind of try and grasp onto, I just need one simple solution, but that's just not the case. And you need to live with what the reality is, because typically these conversations are being had with non-autistic people, even at the table, or as being part of that conversation. So that's something we really kind of need to address and kind of keep in mind, even when we encounter it maybe on social media or the people in our lives who maybe share opinions like this, maybe even just mentioning that is actually a false statement, and just routinely kind of shutting that down. The next piece is flexible communication choices help autistic people engage fully, and that of course falls under our true category. So providing options, if you're in the workplace, like written agendas or email follow-ups, ensures clear understanding and reduces stress. This is going to be coming into our heading of communication, but if you want to talk a little bit about this point, Kayla.
Yeah, so I'm going to really get into the kind of nitty gritty with that and why it's so important when we talk about information processing. But again, having that multiple modes of communication actually works for everyone. So that's what we call universal design, and we all have different communication preferences. So maybe you might prefer a phone call, or I might prefer an email. And it's just taking that time and consideration that we can do both.
Yeah.
We can have that phone call because that's what suits you, but then also a follow-up email to say, hey, Caitlin, this is what we talked about in the call, because that's how I prefer to communicate. So it's just having that space and that empathy that we're different, and our brains work differently. So let's accommodate for both.
And I also think we live in an era now that technology supports very easily multimodal kind of fashions of communication. So you have a meeting online now, and there's numerous note-taking tools you can implement that will automatically have that follow-up email actually be generated. The next one, we have quiet areas or short sensory breaks support focus and well-being. And I think, of course, this is going to be falling under our true heading, which is allowing access to low stimulus spaces or brief pauses helps maintain regulation and productivity. We're going to be talking a little bit more about kind of stimulation later on, stimulus and spaces related to it. We want to talk a little bit about that, Caitlin.
Yeah, so quiet spaces, sensory rooms, we talk a lot about those. And I think the goal is always just to have somebody to, if they do get overwhelmed or stressed, or, if they just need to have some privacy or to stim or whatever it is, that they have a space that's separate from everybody else. That privacy, that, regulation space, that ability to take a step away from that really crowded room that maybe is too bright or too loud is really important for autistic people. And I think it's sometimes, again, we talk about sensory rooms, we don't always talk about why they're needed.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we're going to be deeper diving into that in just a little bit. Now, another misconception that I think a lot of people may have encountered is that bad parenting causes autism. And of course, this is falling under our false category. Autism is a neurodevelopmental difference present from birth and is not caused by parenting style or family environment.
Yeah.
So this, I think, is a really important one. This can be present in communities, this can be present in schools, and this can even be present in social circles if you have some people in your life who may hold this misconception. But yeah, do you want to comment on that one, Caitlin, as well?
Yeah, so I typically actually hear this from parents of autistic children saying that other people in their lives, whether it be their family or their friends, don't understand their child. So they're saying, well, have you just tried this, or have you tried this parenting technique? And it's a lack of understanding then that that child is actually very dysregulated, and that, you know, there's been maybe a sequence of events or something that's happened that's really upset or frustrated or, you know, dysregulated the child. And what we're seeing then is a big display of emotion because they are dysregulated. It's not, you know, acting out or being bold, but it's actually a child that's really struggling. But sometimes again, that unsolicited parenting advice is where parents of autistic children will hear this quite a lot, and it's a difficult place for them to be.
100%. Calling into question your parenting in that situation is terrible. And I think you mentioned it there. And I think even in Irish contexts, it comes up so much, that child is so bold. Like bold is just thrown around so much, and it's typically thrown around by people who have no lived experience interacting with autistic people or any autistic people in their lives. And it's a very harsh comment to make. And I think we're going to be revisiting this throughout today's session, which is just those moments of pausing and having a little bit of a self-reflection about, is there more to this situation that I'm witnessing right now than instantly jumping to the malice or the ill intent or the worst possible outcome there as well. And then the last one then is autism is, quote, on the rise. Now, I'm sure some people are thinking, what exactly does that mean? We left it open to interpretation there, but it's probably a phrase some people will have encountered. And that is, of course, false. The apparent increase reflects better awareness, broader diagnostic criteria, and improved identification. And I think a lot of the times people just relate this back to historic data. And like, oh, back in the day, this wasn't the issue. But of course, that makes no sense, right?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all. So I think there's kind of three things that I always like to talk about around this. So number one is that 30 years ago, if you were autistic and you received an autism diagnosis, what that meant usually was that you were sent away to a mental health institution, and you stayed there for the duration of your life. So you see more autistic people now because now we have moved into a world for the better, which is now we're allowed to be here. So now we are included within society, and there's supports within society, and we're not just sent to the outside, right? But also 30 years ago, the diagnostic criteria for an autism diagnosis was very narrow. So it's typically people with high support needs that received a diagnosis. Now we've realized that, like we saw in that spectrum at the start, autism is such a unique experience, and it's experienced very differently for so many different autistic individuals. So there's nuance within that. So we understand autism more, which means, you know, people that went undiagnosed 30 years ago now do receive a diagnosis. We still have a ways to go with that, and that the undiagnosis and misdiagnosis is still prevalent, but we have got a lot better. But we also, you know, as we now know better and diagnose people correctly and early where we should, we also have this population of adults that went undiagnosed for a huge portion of their life, and now they're figuring out that they're autistic later in life. I was one of those individuals, so I didn't receive my diagnosis until I was an adult. And so a lot of the time we have typically parents where they get a diagnosis for their child, and then they see the similarities in their experiences and their child's, which leads them to a diagnosis. So there's kind of lots of different factors to kind of take into consideration. You know, it's not that there's more autistic people, we've always been there, but now we are getting diagnosed a lot more accurately and a lot better.
And I suppose on that kind of final point before we move on, I'm sure there's probably a lot of adults out there who maybe fall into the trap of thinking, I'm too old to look into this, or I do connect with a lot of these pieces that Michael and Caitlin's talk about today, but you know, I'm actually too old. Like, I've already gotten into my routines and my patterns, and I've lived my life, but you're never really too old to kind of fully experience your true self. I think.
No, you're never too late, and a diagnosis brings so much understanding and self-reflection about your life and your experiences, and it explains a lot for a lot of people who have gone a large portion of their life without being diagnosed. I recently was working with a 76-year-old man who just received his diagnosis, and he thought, and when talking about his experience, he said, it's amazing to finally understand fully who I am, and, you know, be able to have those supports in place. And what he said was, you just did what you had to do when I was younger. You put the supports in place, but they weren't called supports. And one thing he said was, you know, for him, we'll call him Sean. For Sean, what he said was, you know, people used to be like, there wasn't the word autism, but people would still describe him as different.
Yeah.
You know, they would be like, oh, that's just Sean.
Yeah.
You know, that's the way he is. He's a bit different. And so they didn't have the word autism, but they still recognized that he was different and that his brain did work a little bit differently. So now we just have the word. That's the difference.
100%. Okay, fantastic. So we've covered quite a lot here, folks. What we want to do now is we want to kind of look at the key autistic characteristics that we're going to deeper dive in for the second half of today's session. The first one we have is sensory processing differences. We then also will follow that by communication and social differences that we're going to explore. We're going to be looking at stimming, which is maybe a word you've heard about before, because thankfully it's kind of an awareness around has risen quite a bit, but we're going to be looking at a definition of that and the forms that it takes. And we're also going to be looking at information processing differences, and we're going to deep dive into those in just a moment. Now, the first one we want to look at, Caitlin, is one that I think is really interesting because half of it I think a lot of the population would know, and half of it they probably won't. So, characteristic that autistic people may have is hypersensitivity. This is sensing things more intensely than usual. So, everyday sounds, lights, or smells can feel overwhelming. This is sight, taste, smell, sound, and so on. That's hypersensitivity. But there's also another side of this, right?
Yes, there is, and that's hyposensitivity. So people who experience their senses less intensely or less, you know, they don't experience them as much as other people. So I think it's hard to explain sensory processing differences to neurotypical people sometimes. So I might just explain it kind of quite quickly. But for neurotypical people, if you are neurotypical, your brain experiences your senses kind of all at the same level. So this like happy middle, right? That's where everyone wants to be, is this happy middle. But for us as autistic people, we can be either very sensitive or have a low sensitivity, right? And then within that, it can differ for each sense. So you might be very sensitive to sight and have a low sensitivity to sound. You might be super sensitive to touch or have a low sensitivity to taste. So that's what we call someone's sensory profile. It's really different for each person. And so it's really individual. And we talk a lot about people, you know, being very sensitive to sight or very sensitive to sound, but we don't talk about the low sensitivity. And that's what someone we would call who has a low sensitivity would be a sensory seeker. So they look for more sensory input, right? So if you have someone who is a low sensitivity to sound, they want more sound. Because again, we want to be at this happy middle, right? And that's where we're all trying to get. So if somebody is super sensitive, they need to block out some of their sensory input to get to that happy middle. But if somebody is low sensitivity, they are trying to get more to get to that happy middle. So they'll look for more. So someone who has a low sensitivity, what they might do is, if they have a low sensitivity to sound, let's say, what they're going to do is look for more sound. So they might play their music really loud or have the TV up really loud. Or if they're in a really, really quiet space, they might make more sound themselves. So again, what they're trying to do is just regulate themselves. They're just trying to get to that happy middle. And that's really easy for neurotypical people because they exist at that happy middle. But us, you know, we're very up and down. And so we'll have to put different supports in place in order to get to that happy middle.
And I think that is really interesting, that kind of barometer, that middle line, I think is a great way to kind of visualize it, and everyone kind of seeking to be there. And I also think I would like to even hear maybe in the Q&A of how many people even knew about the hyposensitivity, because it's something I only recently found out about the past number of years in comparison to hypersensitivity, which is focused on quite a bit and which is talked about quite a bit. It's important to note that both sides exist and both sides should be considered when creating spaces or events and so on and so forth, you know? And then next up then we have kind of sensory PPE. So we're talking about this piece here, and we have a couple of different examples of it. We have ear defenders and buds and headphones. We have sunglasses, PEEP caps, hoods, sensory friendly clothing, which again can hopefully maybe dampen some of that, or even with our headphones increase some of that as well with our music. We have fidget jewelry, tools, toys and tools, and we even have cushions, seating choices, or visual guides, which we're going to be talking about in just a moment. But do you want to talk a little bit about, Caitlin, about this kind of sensory PPE and maybe recognizing it and maybe even utilizing it, or possibly offering it to some people in our lives and so on, you know?
Yeah. So, as an autistic person, I think sometimes people expect us to just know everything about ourselves, but it's a journey, right? So, not everyone knows what their sensory profile is. You have to figure it out and have some self awareness around that. So, it's a bit of a journey, but again, like we can control our sensory input in one place, and that's our home. But when we step outside of our home, we have no control over how loud or bright or what the smells are or the texture of what we're sitting on or our seating or anything like that. And that oftentimes isn't meeting someone's sensory profile. So we have these sensory PPE or these sensory supports that we use as autistic people to hopefully get to that happy middle, to help us. So if it's too loud, we can pop our noise cancelling headphones on. If it's not loud enough, we can pop our headphones on and play music so it is loud enough for us. If we can go to somewhere and there's a choice of seating, that's great, because if I prefer soft seating that meets my sensory profile, but you might prefer hard surface seating because that meets your sensory profile. So there's so much difference within that, that a lot of the time we have to bring those supports around with us just so that we can exist comfortably.
I think what's really important is calling some of these out as well. If you recognize them, if you're a school teacher joining us, or if you're in a workplace or the community around you, if you see someone wear headphones quite a bit, a lot of the time, sometimes maybe, again, people jumping to this ill intent, oh, they're just constantly just listening to their music or they're listening to their podcast, they're distracted. But that's really not the case. It's just taking that moment to pause and think, okay, maybe this isn't just a tool for recreational enjoyment. Maybe this is a tool that they're using to be able to kind of go about their days enjoyably, you know?
And there's also a misconception, I think, that if someone has their headphones on, that they don't want to talk. And we see that a lot in the workplace, where it's a bit of a barrier for some people, but it's just not true. I can have my noise cancelling headphones on and still hear you perfectly fine. And so
I do talk very loud.
So it's something that I think, we need to challenge that misconception a little bit, and, we can still have a conversation with our headphones on. We can still hear people and all that kind of stuff. They don't block out all the sounds. They just dampen them down. So again, if someone needs more sound and that's why they're playing music, a lot of the times people, again, who need more stimulus, need more from their sensory input. The music, if they're playing that or listening to something while they're working, actually helps them focus more, because it means they're at that happy middle, they're regulated. And so it's just, again, if that's not something you would do, it's taking the second to think, well, their brain must work differently than mine then, and that's why they need that support.
100%. And it's all about maybe even possibly asking those questions that come from a good place. That not put people on the spot. Don't say it in open forums that draw attention to it. But if you have a personal relationship, or maybe they're a student or an employee that you work with, or a colleague or a friend, and why do you listen to the headphones all the time? Do you need that? And recognizing, do you want me to talk to you right now, or is that kind of a signal to not talk? All of that is just open conversations that come from good places, solve a lot of these issues and a lot of these assumptions, these negative assumptions that we may hold about just classifying people as, they just have their headphones, they're not listening to me, and so on.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point around preferences, and that, for some people, they pop their headphones on, that does mean they don't want to talk. But it's just having some understanding and awareness that you can actually ask. It's a really considerate thing to ask somebody what their preferences are. So to ask them, hey, do you mind having a chat when you're on your headphones, or is that a do not disturb time? And asking them that's not taboo. There's nothing wrong with that. It means that you're considering their individual preference in that.
100%. And I'm sure everybody would love to be on the receiving end of that as well, and being able to share their preferences. So keeping us moving, folks, we have a great quote here. Autistic people must learn scientifically what non-autistic people learn instinctively. So what does that mean to you, Kayla?
So what that means essentially is, if you're neurotypical, you kind of have all of these social instincts built in the back of your mind, right? They live in your subconscious and they help you navigate, the world. They help you say, it's okay to say this in work, or it's not okay to say this. It's okay to do this in a particular setting, but it's not okay to do that. And again, if you're neurotypical, you don't have to think twice about those things because you have those social instincts built in. We don't have those social instincts as autistic people. We didn't get that upgrade in the brain. And so what that means is that the way that we learn how to, exist in social situations, in the workplace, in education, is through trial and error. So we have to go in, exist, and maybe do the thing that we're not supposed to do. And then, we figure out, okay, I won't do that next time, or I won't say that next time. But it's having this space where it's okay to mess up, or it's okay to not know things, is really important, because a lot of the time, when we go into the workplace and maybe we say something we're not supposed to say, people will hold that against us, and they don't give us that time to adapt and learn. But I think on the other side as well, a lot of the time people don't tell us what we're supposed to do, or they don't tell us the rules or how we should exist, and so that's difficult too for us.
And I think, again, it's such a reoccurring theme, which is just building these perceptions of people around us in our heads without ever communicating it to the person, without questioning it, without having that open dialogue. It's just something that just a little conversation can solve a lot of. And I think we had a great chat as well before we went live. It could be in the workplace, could be in communities, could even be in your own social circles, which is the unwritten rules. And I think this is a really, really interesting point. And if this is one of the major takeaways from today, I think we'd be very happy with it, which is unwritten rules. Maybe they might not be written, but they still need to be said.
Yes.
They still need to be said at least once, because you can't just judge someone or maybe critique someone or give out to somebody for breaking a rule that no one has even mentioned or wrote down.
Exactly. And I think intention is really important here. A lot of the time people assume that there's ill intent behind something, when a lot of the time for autistic individuals, it's like, well, actually, I just didn't know that. I didn't know that that's the way I was supposed to do this, and that there was a way I was supposed to do this, or, I wasn't allowed to talk about that. So it's just a lack of knowing. It's not, ill intent. And sometimes people take it up as rude, or, they take it up as ill intent. But it's just stopping, I think, for a second and thinking, did they have mean intentions behind that, or did they actually just not know that this was a rule that exists? And maybe I should tell them.
Yeah, 100%. So keeping us moving now, folks, let's have a quick look at the neurotypical versus autistic communication. I think we've touched upon some of these already today, but what we've done, we've just kind of compared and contrasted some of the kind of the key ones that's kind of stood out. And a couple that we really want to kind of have a look at is indirect may soften opinions. Falls under the neurotypical communication style.
Yeah.
And I think this is one that's really, really interesting, because once again, it's something that we may apply ill intent to. So a neurotypical person may see somebody wearing something that they might not think is the best fit for their fashion or their style, or maybe doing an action that they don't believe in, and they maybe typically soften that quite a bit. But an autistic communication style, when they're approaching that, they might be a little bit more honest, a little bit more direct about it, which can sometimes come off as quote unquote blunt or as a negative thing.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the main thing with the neurotypical and autistic communication. It's not that either is right or wrong, but they're very different. And so what that means is it's hard for sometimes autistic people to understand neurotypical people, and vice versa.
Yeah.
It works both ways. There's this barrier in between. But again, it's not that either is right or wrong. They're just really different. So again, if you would be a more indirect person, and if somebody said, oh, what do you think of my dress? You might think, in your head, oh, it's not really that nice, or it's not great, but you don't want to maybe offend or hurt somebody, so you'll say, oh, it's lovely, right? But for me as an autistic person, again, if somebody asks me a question and asks my opinion, what do you think of my dress? I would say it. So I would say, look, it's not your colour, it's not the nicest, and I'm speaking quite honestly and directly. A neurotypical person might think, why would you say that? That's rude.
Yeah.
But to me, they've asked my opinion, so I'm going to give my honest answer. If they didn't want my opinion, they wouldn't have asked, right? So again, it's just different, and it's hard to understand somebody else's communication if that's not how your brain works. Like if we think about that image we saw at the start with the two different brains, that's what we have to remember in this, that our brains work differently, we communicate differently, but neither is right or wrong. Again, we would tend to be more honest and direct as autistic people, because that's what feels authentic to us.
Yeah, 100%. And once again, it's that consideration of, if someone is honest and direct with you, is again having that conversation and realizing, is this person sharing this direct opinion with ill intent, or is it meant to be harsh? or are they just speaking honestly? Because I asked them to be honest, you know? And I think another one, there's a couple there, you guys can have a read through, folks, but I think another one that is showing empathy. So again, sometimes we may have a work colleague or a friend that may say, oh, I'm having a really tough time at work. And typically a neurotypical response would be something along the lines of, oh, that sounds terrible, that sounds like a really rough time, buddy, hope it all works out for you. But then in autistic communication, they may show empathy through sharing a similar personal story. Now that is kind of something that I think, again, it's something to be very aware of, because I think we see a lot of the times we've been in those social situations where, oh, they're just trying to steal the quote unquote limelight from it, but that's not the case.
No. And it's difficult to understand, I think, if again you are neurotypical, but the reason that we, would share a similar story in that situation is what we're trying to do is show our empathy by saying, I've been where you are. So you're saying you're going through a difficult time, and I'm sharing that I was also through that difficult time. And this is what I did to get through it. This is how I, persevered through that difficult situation. And what we're trying to do there is relate by saying we are the same, we are similar. And I think sometimes, again, people, don't understand the intent behind that and would say, oh, they just always want to talk about themselves. They're just changing the topic to talk about themselves. But take a second to think, are they sharing a similar story that, I've just talked about, and maybe they're trying to relate through that. They're trying to say, I'm here for you because I've been there and I understand what you're going through. So it's, again, taking a second to have a bit of empathy and think, is there ill intent here, or is somebody actually trying to connect with me about this?
100%. And I also think we're going to talk about it a little bit later on as well. But like, even when you're experiencing some of these trends on like TikToks and Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, and a lot of them are so wide sweeping, which is you have to cut out that toxic friend who always makes it about themselves, or something along those lines. These sweeping statements that take absolutely nothing what we've talked about earlier on, unique situations and the complexity of the human experience of who somebody is, because someone might fall into that trap and might think instantly, oh, I've been told that's a toxic thing to have, so that's someone I'm going to cut out of my life. And it's just having that understanding, like those snap responses and those sweeping statements, if it's too broad, it's typically not something that we listen to.
And it doesn't allow for the differences that we're talking about here. It doesn't allow for those social communication differences. And what we really should be doing is having space for people to communicate differently. Like, again, I'd have a lot of autistic friends, and we will ramble away at each other, and we're sharing each other's stories, and we're interrupting each other, and we're not following any of those social rules that people say are so important. But we both understand that's our communication style, and those are rich and fulfilling conversations, but they wouldn't meet any of the social norms that other people would have. So it's allowing for that difference.
100%. And I think that's a great point. Is key takeaway from this is that applying those social norms, those extremely broad ones, just maybe have it stop and think, does it actually apply to this situation? And does it apply to people in your life, whether it's work colleagues or friends or people you interact with on a daily basis in your community? So keeping it moving, folks. In the topic of kind of communication, we have a little bit of a quote here. Autistic people have a mixed profile of abilities. So looking at this, 20 to 30% of autistic people are non-speaking. And then the remainder have either delayed in developing speech and language, or have an average or above average verbal ability. Okay? Now, the big thing to kind of take away here, Ken, and I think we were talking about it before, is that, again, some people fall into the trap of thinking, non-speaking, okay, that must equate it's non-thinking. But that is absolutely not the case, correct?
No, not at all. And I think it's really difficult for non-speaking individuals to experience the world, where a lot of individuals that they interact with think that just because they don't communicate through words means that they don't have the same thoughts, emotions, or feelings as everyone else. But of course they do. Non-speaking autistic just means that you don't communicate through words. That's all that means. Of course, they have rich and fulfilling lives the same way as the rest of us, and complex, thoughts, feelings, and emotions the same way as we do as well.
100%. And again, I think it's something just to stop and think about, you know what I mean? And if you hold this opinion, and if it's something maybe you unconsciously hold, something you address, something to think about and reflect on, that non-speaking is not equal to non-thinking. And just holding that and bringing that forward and sharing that with the people around you in your lives as well. Because these are some good messages to have. But when we were talking about that non-speaking kind of communication, but that communication comes in many different forms. So we're going to deep dive in some of them, but we have our AAC devices.
Yeah.
We have our noises or
Echolalia.
echolalia. There we go. We have communication cards. We have law and sign language, of course. And then we have spellers and spelling as well. So these kind of come in a lot of kind of different forms. Is there any kind of ones you want to have a deep dive on, Caitlin?
So the main thing I think I want to say on this is that you have to remember, if you woke up tomorrow and you didn't have your words to communicate, if you couldn't communicate with your parents or your friends or your families, just have a chit chat or to let them know that you were having a hard time, it would be a very frustrating place to be, right? And that's the main thing, is that there's a communication barrier here for non-speaking individuals. They don't get to have a chat the same way as you and I do. They don't get to, easily express what they're going through or what they want or desire, or to talk about their interests or anything like that. It's frustrating. It's a frustrating place to be. And these communication supports we have in place here, the main thing to remember is that these help ease that isolation, that communication barrier, and to make things a little bit easier. So again, if you're supporting an autistic person who's non-speaking, it's never too late to implement a support in communication. It's never too late to explore ways that we can support communication and hopefully ease some of that frustration and isolation that they do feel.
100%. And I also think a big conversation we had just before this was these are numerous different ways of communicating. It's not, let's say, our quote unquote traditional sense of speaking, but these are still communication methods. And it's something we were talking about is encountering someone who may be non-speaking and not directly communicating with them.
Yeah, so a lot of the time non-speaking people will share experiences they've had around they're out in public in the world and they might be with a parent or a support person, and an individual will speak to their parent and support person but ignore them and not acknowledge them as a human being. And that's so difficult, right? That's a horrible place for any of us to be. It's very invalidating and dehumanizing, and not a place that any of us would like to be in. So it's, remembering that non-speaking individuals have the same human experience as us, and they do crave connection the same way as all of us. And so include non-speaking people in your conversations and your interactions, and include them in your thoughts, of planning events and supporting colleagues, students in school, wherever it may be. Non-speaking people are just as important a member of our community as anybody else.
100%. And then keeping it moving, we also then have stimming, Caitlin, right? So this comes up in many different forms. Stimming is the action of repetitive behaviors or noises to help emotional regulation. So we have arm, leg, body movement and rocking. We have swinging, hand flapping, clicking, clapping or scratching, spinning or tapping. But really what we're showing here is that it can come in many, many different forms, correct?
Yeah. And everyone stims. So not just us as autistic people, neurotypical people stim too. So like if you're sitting in a meeting and you're sitting still for too long, you'll move in your chair, you'll readjust, you'll change your body language. You might doodle, or you might tap your foot or click your pen. Those are all stims. And the reason you're doing it, again, is to help regulate yourself. If you sit still for too long, your brain gets bored, it gets disengaged, it turns off. So in order to keep your focus, you move in some sort of way. We all do it, but for us as autistic people, we do it more because we have more to process. We have more going on in our minds, especially with sensory processing. So it helps us to regulate ourselves by moving in some sort of way. So we might move in ways that are difficult to neurotypical people or different to neurotypical people, or we might move in similar ways, but it's all to just help regulate our emotions. And the thing to remember about stimming is that we do it for every emotion. So some people think, again, a myth that we would see is that when someone stims, it means they're stressed or overwhelmed, but that's not the case. We stim for every emotion. We stim when we're happy, we stim when we're sad, we stim when we're excited or something's funny, and then we do also stim when we're stressed or overwhelmed.
And I think something we were talking about earlier on is those stims represent many different emotions.
Yeah.
But actually being able to kind of recognize, let's say, a stim that appears during stressful periods, or a stim that's appearing during happy periods, or even anxious periods, and so on and so forth. And I think, again, what we were talking about was it's just all about open communication, possibly asking the person if it's coming from a place of a good intent, not in open forms, not put them on the spots, or even just learns through interaction and being able to recognize that and having those keeping an eye out for it will allow you to recognize, okay, they're in an anxious period right now. How can I actually help alleviate that?
Yeah.
And able to distinguish that between their happy stimming or just their general energy release stimming, right?
Yeah, we tend to have go-to stims for each emotion most of the time. So we'll have a happy stim that we'll do when we're happy. We'll have a stim that we do when we're stressed or overwhelmed. And so being able to recognize there's a difference between the two is important.
Yeah, 100%. So keeping us moving then, folks, we also then have information processing. So this kind of comes in three kind of key headings. Difference in visual, written, or auditory processing, delayed response time, and can even appear inattentive. So information processing can look very different for a lot of different people, Caitlin. How does it typically kind of be represented in an autistic person?
So autistic people usually have visual brains, which means when we think inside of our mind, we hear our thoughts, but we also can see our thoughts. So we see in pictures, images, movies, that's how we think, right? And because we think visually, that means that we learn best visually, we remember, we understand things best when we can see them. Right? And so that's why we have a big emphasis on visual supports for autistic people. It's because that's working with the brain, the way our brain works. You know, you're communicating in a way that my brain naturally thinks. And so I'm way more likely to understand and remember what you're saying. And so what that means is that sometimes you might have a hard time with the auditory processing. So if we just, you know, someone's just speaking to us, it might be a little bit difficult for us.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think it comes up quite often in terms of you share a piece of information or a lot of information, and then we instantly follow up with that question of, did you hear me? Did you understand me? Did you get me? And it's just that pause. It is that pause. And if it is a miscommunication and they didn't hear, they will tell you.
Yeah.
There's no point putting people under the pressure again of just getting that confirmation. I think it is just allowing that little bit of time when speaking with anybody and allowing them their time to actually process that. So keeping us moving then, folks, as well. What's really important is looking at some of the experiences, but also recognizing the strengths, autistic strengths as well. So these come in many different forms: attention to detail, hyperfocus, creativity, strong memory, reliability, perspective, observation skills, and expertise. There's quite a lot here, Caitlin, and they all kind of connect. I think they all kind of intersect as well here as well. But it's important to kind of recognize these strengths. And one of the major ones we were looking at earlier on, myself and yourself, as we were having a chat before we went live, was expertise.
Yeah. So we have what we call like passionate interests or special interests as autistic people, and that's like an interest or a hobby that, you know, we're really involved in or that we really, really love and are really passionate about. And I think a lot of the time when we talk about supporting autistic people, we talk about the things that are difficult or, you know, that we find hard, which is important, but we also need to talk about the strengths and that, you know, level of expertise, those passionate interests are something that are so important because they really make us so happy. There's something that really fill us back up when we're having a hard time. So I always say the big emphasis on expertise and that special or passionate interest, because it's something that makes us so happy and that we really, really love. And that can look like, you know, they come in all different shapes and forms. So it might be someone who really loves cars or a particular time in Irish history or, you know, a certain animal. And it's that interest or hobby that will keep them going on the hard days. So they are really important for us.
And I also think not putting it into a specific box. So it's only these kind of special interests. It can be anything.
It can get so niche. It can be anything. You know, and that's what we'd always hear about the trains. Autistic people love trains. Well, not all of us love trains, you know. And it's different for each person, and it's remembering that, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work here. It's such an individual experience. So you need to get to know the person in front of you to get to know how to support them and communicate with them best.
And I also think we were talking about how much it means and how far it goes if you show an interest in their area of special interest there as well. And this could be the students in your class, this could be your employees or your colleagues or your friends, even showing a small bit of interest in that and being open to walking into that world that they have such a vested interest in. I think it means a lot.
It does, because that's how we prefer. You might have seen on the communication slide that we have a preference for deep conversation, and that's how we prefer to communicate and socialize. We want to get to know you better, and we want to, you to get to know us better, because you're asking about our interests and we're talking about our hobbies. That's how you really get to know an autistic person, is ask them what their special interest is or their passionate interest is, and you'll get to know them on such a deeper level.
100%. I'd also like to give a shout out to everyone in the Q&A as well. We have just gone a little bit over our scheduled time. This recording will be live through our As I Am channels after today's session, as well as the slides being shared as well, so you can come back and reference that as well. Myself and Caitlin are going to keep continuing having a few chats, but if anyone needs to drop off, that is perfectly a-okay. Thank you so much for joining us. The recording will be live very shortly after today's session, but we have a few more bits to talk about, right?
Yes.
So if you can stick around, be sure to do so, folks. So another kind of key piece we like to talk about and that we kind of were planning for today was deeper diving on the predictability of it. So many autistic people have a preference for routine and predictability. Unexpected changes to routine can lead to anxiety and or meltdowns or shutdowns. Autistic people feel safe when there is consistent routine in place. So I think maybe some people may have known this, but do you want to tell us a little bit about the role routines play in an autistic person's life experience?
Yeah, of course. So again, like we saw that spectrum at the start, it's really individual to what your preference is, on how important this is to you. But the why we have a preference for routine and predictability a lot of the time is because we want to know what's going to happen so we can prepare ourselves mentally for that experience. Because again, when we're going somewhere new, we're having to think about the sensory experience of it all. And neurotypical people don't have to think about that, because they're at that happy middle all the time, but we're not. So when we're going somewhere new, we're having to think about, is it going to be too light or too bright or too loud or too overwhelming? Is it going to be, something that's going to set me off and I'm going to not be able to be there when I want to be there? Is it going to be too crowded? All of those things we have to think about because of our sensory profiles. And so having a routine means that we always know what's going to happen. I've been to this place before. I know the supermarket inside out. I know where everything is. I don't have to mentally think about what's going to happen. And then when the predictability pieces for when we're going somewhere new, that we feel prepared for that new situation, that new experience that we're going to have. And that reduces our anxiety a lot, and it makes everything a lot easier.
And I think we were talking as well about how to actually provide some information that might ease that anxiety, might ease that stress, and actually help maybe lean into the predictability side of things. And as I am put together a little bit of a checklist here, is a really, really good one. Some of these things being the venue information, contact information. One you pulled out was parking was a major one as well. And these are things that we kind of just assume, they'll figure out when they get here or they figure out when they come here. But sharing that little piece ahead of time can actually mean quite a lot to people.
Yeah, it does. And it just means that the mental preparation that you have to do about thinking about all the possibilities reduces, because you have exactly what's going to happen. And so it just reduces that mental load of preparing for somewhere new. So having these information before you go means that you already know exactly what's going to happen. So you don't have to think about, okay, when I get there, where am I going to go? What am I going to park? Let me look on Google Maps and see what the street parking is like and all that kind of stuff. If you have somebody say, hey, when you get here, we have a car park around back. So you can just pull in through the lane and then there's a space there for you. Means I don't then have to think about, okay, what do I need to do when I arrive?
100%. And I think that information can be shared in something that As I Am does for all their events, and it's something they talk about quite a lot, which is a visual guide. Yeah. And visual guides might not be a term people may have. What exactly is a visual guide?
Visual guide, so if you've heard of a social story, it's the same thing. So a visual guide, you can see on the screen here, there's an example of one. So it's usually like a PDF format, and it's a text and picture walkthrough of what you're going to experience. So it gives that preparation piece. So it shows you the outside of the building for when you arrive. It might have parking information on it. It tells you, when you get to the event, this is what to expect, so that there's no, what ifs or a lack of predictability. But again, we have everything. And again, why you're providing that through images a lot of the time, through a visual guide, is because that's how our brains work. We remember the images, we remember the visuals. And so holding on to that information is a lot easier for us when we have a visual. A 360 walkthrough video, if anyone's ever seen any of them, that does the same thing. So it gives you a walk through the space so that when I arrive, I know exactly where I'm going, I know what to expect, and I feel like I'm prepared for the situation.
What we also talked about, Caitlin, was a visual guide also gives a good kind of framework and maybe an assessment framework for whatever event you're hosting, whatever meeting you're hosting, what you might be missing out on.
Yeah.
So you might be saying, okay, what do I need to share here? Do I actually have my quiet space or my quiet room dedicated there? Do I have my fidget tools and fidget toys available on site there as well? Kind of gives you an opportunity to reflect on how accessible your actual event is when putting together a visual guide. So that should nearly be point one, and I'm sure you'll have lots of sub-points then afterwards in terms of when you're actually planning something, you know?
Yes, exactly.
So then when we're actually talking about addressing some of those sensory barriers, Caitlin, the first one would be auditing the sensory environment, offering quiet spaces, and then sensory tools as standard. Those would kind of be the big three pillars, right?
Yeah. 100%. So, like, if you're neurotypical, when you walk into a room, you don't have to think about the sensory environment. So, when we say take an audit, it's always good to just stop and take 2 minutes before, whether that's a teacher in a classroom or that you're conducting an interview, and having a look around the interview room and thinking, is it too bright? Is there a ticking clock there that doesn't annoy me, but it would annoy someone, or someone who is more hypersensitive would have a hard time with that? You know, take a little audit of the room and think, is there anything we can do to make this more comfortable? And then again, to quiet spaces, having that space for us to take a step away and stim or regulate ourselves, or just have a moment of privacy, is really important. And again, we shouldn't be going into spaces and feeling uncomfortable and like there's no support. We should feel supported in the spaces we go to. Like I said, you can't control your sensory input when you step outside of your home as an autistic person. But when you go into a space where they've taught about the sensory environment, they've considered these things, they've provided sensory tools, you feel welcomed, you feel safe to exist there. And that's what we want for all autistic people.
And speaking of that, it's all about asking for feedback.
Yes.
So through the implementation of your audit, through the creation of these quiet spaces, through even which sensory tools to get for your space, making sure everyone is at the table there to be able to share their voice and give that kind of feedback is crucial.
Yes. So we always say in As I Am, nothing about us without us. So what that means is autistic people should be included in all of these steps. So you should be asking autistic people about the sensory environment, asking them for feedback on the quiet space or what they want in the quiet space, asking them about, what STEM toys or sensory tools do you like and what should we include? What are your recommendations? So always include autistic people and our voices in these conversations.
100%. Another quick one we kind of want to touch on, which might be new for some people, is rules and expectations. So this kind of comes in at four kind of key kind of pillars. If it's not written down, then it's not a rule. Pre-written rules, culture notes, and visual aids should be shared early, similar to the visual guide we just looked at. Clarity around what's allowed and what's not allowed, and then even explain the consequences for breaking those rules. So this could be for your classroom, this could be for your event, this could be for your workplace. And I think we covered quite a lot on this already, Caitlin, but is there anything else you'd like to add on this piece?
I think it comes back to that what we started at we talked about at the start with the myths. Even when people think someone is doing something they're not supposed to do, that means they're bold. We look at it as behavior, right? But we have to remember intention. Intention exists, right? So if I don't know something is a rule and I accidentally break it, have I broken the rule because I didn't know it existed? So provide written rules is really important, especially when you're supporting young people, because we can't assume that we always know what the rules are. And especially we don't have those social instincts to give us that leg up, the same as neurotypical people. And so we need the rules to be written down. We need some patience for the time it takes to understand and learn those rules as well. So there's so much to it. I think the big thing is just patience and understanding, and making sure that you're being clear in your expectation of what someone should do or how they should exist is important.
We said it before and we say it again, people can't break an unwritten rule because it's not a rule if it's not written down somewhere. Fantastic. So our last kind of thing we kind of want to touch upon here is communication, and being a communication detective is what we're saying here. And that is just asking the question, what way does this person feel comfortable communicating? And then you're talking about being flexible and patient with them, understanding social preferences, and also being clear and specific. I think this is kind of a good recap of everything we've talked about so far, Caitlin. I think it's good just to kind of visually look at before we say goodbye to everybody. These are some of the things we can kind of take away when interacting and communicating with the autistic people in our lives, or everyone in our lives. What we kind of should be looking at through these kind of 3 or 4 lenses, I should say, right?
Yeah, I think it's most important to think, am I taking my communication preferences and putting them on someone else? So if we think about a group of young autistic people in a group setting, are we forcing them to participate by speaking? And
Yeah.
maybe they're not comfortable. Maybe the way that they like to communicate and interact in a group setting is just by being there and listening to others. So that forced participation piece and things like that, that's maybe not someone's preference. That's not what they feel comfortable doing. They don't want to share in front of a group, but they do enjoy being there, but maybe quietly and listening. Or does someone maybe want to write down what they feel? Do they want to put it in through a picture? Do they want to illustrate how they feel or their thoughts on things? And I think that's really important. There's so many different ways to communicating, and we put such an effort, a big emphasis on speech and language, but there's so many other ways outside of that. And sometimes it's a lot easier for us to communicate through written methods, or again, just kind of being there in the space is important for us as well.
100%. And I think at that point there, just being flexible and being patient, because you may not get it right the first time, but as long as you're kind of open to learning and actually being better at communicating with all people, and also just being flexible with that as well, I think is going to be really, really important. So the last thing we kind of want to touch upon here, Caitlin, before we say goodbye to everybody, is the different communications of information in the modern era. Now, this may be prevalent for some parents or guardians may be joining us, maybe people in different workplaces or even in schools or communities and so on. And there's a lot of different ways to communicate in the modern world. There's some kind of key pieces you want to kind of touch upon before we kind of wrap up in terms of how to actually communicate.
Yeah, so the main thing around this that I kind of want to say is that you have to think about the way that you're communicating your information with somebody. So, for example, if we're having a back and forth conversation, again, autistic people may prefer to have that visual communication, right? So can we use a video or write things down as we're talking to help explain that? But then also what I would say for younger people is you need to communicate in a way that they naturally communicate. So young people, again, so much of their communication is through social media. And sometimes I'll, work with parents and they'll say, I'm having a hard time, I'm trying to get them to explain and understand this point or this skill, or even masking. I'm trying to explain masking, what that is, but my young person is just not understanding it from my point of view. Well, then let's rethink. Okay, so that's not the way that they take in information in true communication, but the way that young people do take information in through communication is through social media. So could we find a TikTok or an Instagram reel that explains masking in a way that my young person is going to understand and relate to, and it's coming from a peer then, so again they're more likely to take that information in.
100%.
So it's just about, again, how can I maybe tweak my communication a little bit to really meet someone else's needs.
And I think you're spot on there. I think even the call out of those TikToks and Instagram reels, I think that is great, even like an action point here as well, because we're living in such a wealth of information and knowledge. It's nearly a guarantee there is a video out there explaining what topic you're focused on. And even just simple searches can allow you to kind of get a wealth of other information as well. And it being on those platforms that our young people, or that many people, majority of people, are living on right now and taking in their information from, being there just shows you're also willing to meet them where they are.
Yeah, exactly. Even if you're teaching life skills like brushing our teeth or, showering, washing, all those kind of things, there's videos to support you in that. And that's a visual communication that you're providing to someone, as well as you speaking to them about it as well.
100%. So folks, this has brought us to the end of today's session. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us for Dream Space Live, a very special Dream Space Live. What did you think of your first appearance of Dream Space?
It was great. It's so much fun.
Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We had a great turnout here today and a lot of great people coming back in the Q&A. Myself and Caitlin might even hang on and even look at some of those. I might even respond to them in text as well. These resources, both the slides and the recording of today's session, will be on demand shortly after today's event through As I Am channel, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. And also, folks, keep an eye out at the end of today's event. When we say goodbye, there's going to be 3 kind of options popping up. Sign up for the Dream Space newsletter, which is where you'll be able to find information on all of our free STEM educational resources that the Dream Space team offer. We also have 2 surveys from the As I Am team. Do you want to maybe take note of a small bit about those surveys, Caitlin, or tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so just as part of the Autism Europe Congress, what we're really trying to do is have as much impact long term as we can. So this is happening across the next 2 days. We kicked off yesterday, but we want to have a long term impact here, right? So that's why we've hosted the session today, is to, again, challenge that myths and misconceptions. And so part of that is we want to get people's feedback on this session and how we've done, you know, and if there's anything you've learned or anything we can do better going forward, please do just let us know. We're always trying to improve. We're always trying to support people as best we can. So, you know, have your voice in there and have that feedback.
Brilliant. Folks, thank you so much for joining me, Michael, for this Dream Space Live. Thank you, Caitlin, for joining us.
No problem.
And I'm sure we'll be seeing you all very soon. Look after yourselves and have a great afternoon. Bye.